Poems of Space and Time. I've long been fascinated with the fantastic imagination. That is, the imagination that can deal with literary, subliterary, supraliterary works, science fiction, fantasy fiction, weird fiction. Now, I don't write fiction, but I do write poetry, and I've been writing it for the last 50 years. So one day I decided what I should put together is a collection of the 360 poems generated by the fantastic imagination, mine, over all those years. And I have now done so in a book called Poems of Space and Time. It's being published by a small publishing house called the Battered Silicon Dispatch Box, and I urge you to check the company's website, Poems of Space and Time. The first poem is called We Would Voyage. We would voyage to the end of the world to peer into the abysm of space, except that there is no edge to the world. We would voyage to the end of time to peer into the period when there is time no longer, except that there is no end of time. We would voyage to the source of the self to peer into the status of the soul, except that there is no source of the self. Except there are no voyages, then except that there are no abysms of space, no periods when there is time no longer, and no sources of the self. One of my childhood idols was A.E. Van Vogt, the famous science fiction writer of the Golden Age. I learned in later years he had been born in the province of Manitoba, so I felt rather closer to him than I had up to that point for his wonderful works. Here's a poem I wrote on the death of A.E. Van Vogt, January 26th, year 2000. This took place about 3 years after my wife Ruth and I met him in his home in Hollywood, California. The poem is subtitled Towards the Secret of the Sevagram. Sevagram is a word that he coined. He was a big man and a proud man and a productive man and a great man who wrote feverishly from his earliest years, but not well into his later years, for stillness descended upon him decades before his end. He thrilled us and then left us the fine, careless rapture of the early astounding stories, as well as the driving narrative accounts of intense mind-body complexities and perplexities, sagas set in space to dramatize the mind-boggling mutations of the human species into the postmodern species. He gazed through the portholes of the imagination of the space beagle and swooned before visions of boundless space, without boundaries, beginnings, or endings, so prairie-like. He resolved that super engines and super beings must abound there, supreme transformations there. In a setting that is indistinguishable from the stars, he himself has now been transported, transformed, transfigured into a new member of one of those post-human species that he knew and described in such heroic terms. Only the engines of his boundaryless imagination and powerful enough to create this world of wonder. That takes us into the future. Let's go into the past. Memories of the Jurassic. It's only 2 lines long. Thunder, lightning, rain, darkness, brightness, noise. Viruses. These are very small. Let us make of this orb, of this globe, so volcanic, so Edenic, our world, our domain, our home. Fantastic literature includes works that aren't literature, but are documentaries. Some Theosophical Thoughts was written after reading sections of H.P. Blavatsky's book, Isis Unveiled, a most imaginative work to be sure. The planet is not a mass of matter, but a living being. The polar ice cap is its polar skull cap. The theory of evolution is based on evidence, but then so is the devolution of the human species. The races and rounds of which history abounds are caught up in the notion of ancient civilizations. A reference to the Akashic records is a reference to a lost language. The lost language is that of the heart. There is also a lost rhythmic and arithmetic of the body. The Promethean powers of creation and recreation are Pythagorean powers that are latent in man. There is a logos in every mythos. The religion of the ancients is the religion of the future. That's full of references to Blavatsky's writings, and they're in quotation marks. In fact, the poem itself was generated by her observation that the North Pole, which is islands, of course, in the Arctic Sea, is a polar skull cap. Great phrase. Man gets lost amidst all this. Here's me. Once I was. Once I was a living something, an embryo, an infant, a child, a toddler, a youngster, a youth, a young man, a bachelor, a married man, a father, a grandfather, a senior, an oldster, a great-grandfather, a dead something. But that is grimacing ahead of the possible future rather than glancing behind the trailing past. Concurrently, I am a breath, a body, a behavior, a belief, a self, a mind, maybe a spirit, possibly a soul. Once is enough because once is the form of forever. As a Canadian, I'm interested in the northern reaches of this land, and the northern reaches include, in my books at least, the Arctic and the North Pole. So I'm fascinated by what the Inuit have to say about the northern reaches of the world and of the human imagination. Arctic sky. The Inuit maintain that their land is a level, rounded plain that extends beyond the horizon where it abruptly ends in the sky. The earth does not move. How could it? Things fall down from the sky and land on the earth. The things also fall up from the earth and land in the sky. So it is the stars that revolve around the land. The stars are not fierce and fiery bodies at all, but pinholes in the sky that let the light through. And Anagok, in his flight, is able to fly up from the earth and land in the sky, where his spirit body may peer through one of these pinholes, through which he will see more than stars if he peers through one of those distant pinholes, and he will see yet more stars and even more lands with little villages like his own little villages, though one Anagok peered through one of those distant pinholes and beheld nothing but feathers. Yet his account is exceptional and hard to believe, much harder to accept than the view that there are stars beyond the stars. The look of the heavens. This is based on astronomy. The heavens have not appeared or looked or felt the way they did before the year 1929, when Edwin Hubble and Milton Humason, having secured their camera to their telescope, snapped their photographs of the bright nebulae that illuminate the dark night sky like so many lanterns. They became the first human beings to see the galaxies beyond the stars that comprise our Milky Way. They became the first astronomers to appreciate the continuous expansion of the known universe. They were astonished to see enormous numbers of galaxies and to know each galaxy to be a cluster of stars. Each galactic cluster, a swirl of diamonds in the velvet of the night, illumining the depths of interstellar space. Islands of stars, isolated, in quarantine, majestic, proud. So like poets, they call these galaxies island universes. Each galaxy is an island. Until then and them, no one knew that each star was in reality a galaxy of stars.